Thank you for joining. As many of you know, this is Cult. Cult is a platform that has a mission to make art more accessible for a young and non-specialist audience. We do that through these weekly online talks and also through in-person get-togethers. We had a great session on Friday at the National Gallery, and we do these on the first Friday of every month. So the next one will be at the beginning of March. But this evening we are going to be talking about Orazio Gentileschi's Rest on the Flight to Egypt online, and that is on the theme of peace, which is part of our series on emotion in painting. So we've had a look at joy, we've had a look at grief. This week we'll be looking at peace, and next week we are looking at pain. I'm particularly excited about this evening's session because the painting we're going to be looking at is one of my favorite pictures. And I think I probably say that every week, but that's what the joy of doing this means, that I can pick and choose themes that do work for pictures that I love. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. So let's get cracking. As usual, I'd like to just pick apart the picture in its most basic sense. What are we looking at? Now, I don't know if I'm the only one here that gets immediately drawn to the fabulous donkey right at the center of the painting. I think this has been dubbed by a number of art historians and otherwise the sweetest animal in the history of art. And we can get up nice and close and have a look at the donkey in a moment. But we've got the donkey at the center. We also have a figure lying completely dead to the world, lying asleep on the lower left, dressed in a sort of burnt orange overgarment, lying on a bulging bag of goodies, of something, of belongings, and also on a lovely ochre yellow coat. On the right hand side, we have a lady, probably a number of you have recognized her already as the Virgin, breastfeeding the Christ child and looking at him tenderly. She's leaning back on her left hand, supported by a stone floor, and she's wearing quite a lot of different overgarments. She's wearing a sort of violet blouse, well, white blouse on the bottom layer, and then a kind of violet overgarment covered in a blue silk dress, and she's actually lying on an even brighter blue mantle there. The two figures in the foreground are set against a wonderful stony wall. This wall is quite dilapidated, it's crumbling. We can see that it's made of brick, covered in plaster, with various cracks and crevices throughout. And behind the wall, we have the aforementioned donkey, who we can only see in profile and only see him from the neck upwards. And then behind the whole scene, we have these wonderful fluffy clouds, which speak rather nicely to the fluffy donkey that we see before them. So here we're actually looking at a biblical story, which many of you might have guessed from the title of the work, and also just from looking at particularly the Virgin and Child there on the lower right. This is called The Rest on the Flight to Egypt, and it's actually a moment that really isn't covered in the New Testament in great detail. In the Gospel of Matthew, there is a description about the moment that Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus flee Bethlehem in order to escape the terrors of King Herod, who is trying to kill the infant Jesus. and they are fleeing to Egypt, and that's literally all we get told. This sort of moment is prompted by as I say, King Herod saying that he wants to kill every child, every infant under the age of 2 years old, in order to track down and find this Messiah who's been born, whom he's told about by the Magi, who of course visit him at the scene of the Nativity. And so in order to escape these horrors, the Holy Family leave and they head to Egypt. There is a bit of it's unsure as to whether or not this moment is in fact the flight to Egypt, or perhaps the return from Egypt, given the age of the Christ child. Here we see he's no newborn, he's slightly bigger. But the Bible doesn't go into any detail really about arrest. This is something that gets developed in sort of early Christian and medieval texts in the Middle Ages, really. And there are various stories that sort of elaborate on this in the Apocrypha. Now, here we have one example of many scenes depicting the rest on the flight to Egypt from the 17th century, but we really know of artists starting to depict this moment in the 14th century. And as with the Massacre of the Innocents, these were often, the Massacre of the Innocents being the horrific moment that King Herod is killing all of the male Jewish children under the age of 2, and the rest on the flight. This sort of subsequent moment, as it were, they're often or can be found together in series of paintings. So why is this such a charming scene, such a charming moment? Why are people wanting to paint it? Well, often the scene is set in a landscape, and here we don't have that. But we have a moment of calm and peace, which of course is why I've chosen it this evening. So, as I say, it's often set in a landscape. This allows artists to experiment with of course, landscape painting, complex compositions, and sort of dramatic settings, while at the same time, of course, painting a religious painting. But what Gentileschi does here is he completely scraps that, and he really just focuses on depicting the figures that are involved in the story, these monumental figures, in a very minimal and clear scene, which in my view feels quite modern in its minimalist nature. And we have this very peaceful moment, very domestic moment, and a moment really of complete exhaustion. And this is a scene Gentileschi is inspired to paint, probably, by the great Italian Baroque painter Caravaggio. Now, Caravaggio paints this scene in the late 1590s in the most beautiful painting, which you can see in the Palazzo Doria Pamphili in Rome, which is actually quite small in scale. It's much smaller than this picture. I should have said this painting's 175 centimeters by 218 centimeters, so it's pretty enormous. A huge piece of canvas, this, and not a huge amount going on it, so all the more dramatic for that. And Caravaggio's painting, conversely, is much smaller in scale. It's much more complex. Do look it up on your screen if you have the ability to do so. It has an angel, a rather sensual angel in the foreground, playing music to Joseph, who's awake, who's showing him his manuscript. And then you have a very, probably one of my favorite moments in in painting is a very, very tender exchange between the Virgin Mary and the Christ child who's asleep in her lap. And there is also a donkey. So Orazio is taking from Caravaggio, of course, this donkey. He's taking a very domestic moment, and also a very a moment of exhaustion, as I've said. But he was probably familiar with the painting by Caravaggio. But what he does is he turns it into something much clearer, much crisper, completely interprets it as his own. And we have this very theatrical, very elegant, technically brilliant in a number of ways painting by Gentileschi. That said, there are a number of shortfalls, and in a sense the kind of naturalism of the painting in a way disguises the fact that there are some technical problems. He's so brilliant at painting drapery and surface textures that this distracts us from any compositional or more formal issues with the picture. So to focus on the former to start with, look at the, oh, we can zoom, which is great this evening, that's exciting. So look at the way that he paints drapery. Gentileschi is, as I say, he's technically, I think, unrivaled in the way in which he paints drapery, the way that it catches the light, the way the color changes. This is just the glare of the painting when the photograph was taken, which is a little distracting. But he includes so many different shades of one color in each of the areas of different color. We have this wonderful jacket with the buttonholes here, and you can just see gentle ripples in the surface of the fabric. And just moving over here to the Virgin, the same of her dress, her blue or violet dress. And then probably one of my favorite details is this sort of velveteen shoulder that she has, that's sort of escaping from the under the white blouse that she's wearing. This unbelievable way in which he manages to depict very, very soft fabric, which of course contrasts to the sort of harder fabric of the white clothing that she's wearing. And then in terms of surface texture, more generally, of course, we have the smoothness of the wool with the cracks in it, and then this beautiful donkey. And look at how he's depicting the fluffy fur. And I just love the way the rope cuts into the spiky mane of the donkey here. Now, before we talk about what the shortcomings are in the composition, I want to focus on what's brilliant about it, which is a hell of a lot more. So that's the surface texture that we've just described. Primarily, where does that come from? The sort of revolution in painting in at this moment, if you like, comes in the form of painting from life, which of course had been happening in the Renaissance. Life drawing was a fundamental part of your training as an artist. But with the 17th century, with the Baroque artists, sort of late 16th, early 17th century, you start to see artists painting from live models, but painting directly from live models. So while live models were used for drawing and establishing design in the previous century, in the 17th century, you really start to see these figures that have been painted from life. And I think in this painting, more than many, you really get a sense that Gentileschi has had a man lying in his studio on some sort of support, and he has painted him as he's seen him. So if we focus now on the figure of Joseph, look at the foreshortening of this leg. We talked about foreshortening last week, the amazing way in which this leg recesses into the back of the painting, and the weight that you see with his head, how it falls over the back of the bag that he's lying on. You really get a sense of the heaviness and the tiredness of Joseph, who is engaged in deep slumber. And then with the Virgin, the way in which she's leaning back with all of her weight on this beautiful foreshortened hand, really gives you again a sense of a real human being leaning back, and Gentileschi translating that into paint. There are, of course, moments that perhaps are less realistic. There is evidence of Orazio and his daughter Artemisia painting the Virgin and Child from a mother and child in their studio. There's documentary evidence that they did do that, or at least Artemisia certainly did. And so, that is something that Orazio may have done. He may have painted a virgin or a mother and child engaged in feeding. However, to me, this feels much more artificial. This is a moment, of course, that he's included into the story. The Christ child is pointing to the womb of the Virgin, obviously with reference to the Immaculate Conception. And I think he probably would have been hard pushed to find a model to pose for him in the exact way. But again, the donkey, this is something that he most certainly 100% has painted from life. So, or at least in this instance, perhaps this may have been from a drawing, but you certainly get a sense that the figures have weight to them. They have a sense of realism to them. The other thing, of course, that comes in at this time is the use of light to create drama in the painting. And this is something that Gentileschi, like the painting from life, takes from the artist Caravaggio. Huge inspiration, not only to him, but to other artists in the first 2 decades of the 17th century. And we can see the very theatrical setup here of the figures. You have these very strong shadows cast beneath the foot of the Virgin here, here with the jacket of Joseph, you can see, and also just this sort of gentle wash of shadow across the across the hand of the Virgin. And I think the whole idea of theatre is really, really relevant in terms of the depth of the stage that they're sitting or lying on. And this is a very bare, stony floor with just independent moments. But because of the recession of the leg, and these very clear planes, parallel planes that Gentileschi is using to construct the painting, you have a real sense of depth. So he's, of course, got a plane at the front with the Virgin and Child set behind him. He's created more space with Joseph, and then you move back into onto the wall where there's a fourth plane, a third plane, and then of course onto the fourth plane right at the back there with the donkey. So you have light, you have real people, you have a sense of space recessing into the canvas. This really is drama, this is theatre. And as I say, that's something that that Gentileschi very much looked to Caravaggio for, but imbued it with his own interpretation, his very elegant and a color palette and technical skill in painting draperies we've discussed. I've actually been fortunate enough to hang this picture because it's currently on loan at the National Gallery. but it's owned by the Birmingham Museums. And it's a very, very difficult picture to hang. Now, that often makes you think there's something up with the picture. Why is it not easy to hang? The artist is playing with us, he's doing something in order to give a certain perspective, or it was intended for a certain place. Now, in this case, it's difficult to hang because we have the figures at our they're sort of at floor level, but then you sort of look down on the wall, but only part of the wall. The upper part, of course, you can't see, but you've both got a bird's eye view and you're looking up at the wall all at once. So it's very, very complicated, because often if you have a view of a wall from above, you would hang it perhaps a little lower because your eye level is meant to sit up above the wall. But in this case, you really don't want to be, your eye level doesn't want to be much higher than Joseph and Mary, because you're meant to really be looking up at them. And added to which, the floor level where Joseph's leg is, suggests that the whole floor in front of the wall is set much higher than the floor on which the donkey's standing behind the wall. So we've got a kind of stepped, in a sense, leveling. Of course, that's not the case, but that's perhaps a stumbling block that Gentileschi's come across in constructing this picture, because the proportions are completely incorrect. If the donkey is that tall and he's on the same ground level as Joseph and Mary, he's going to have incredibly short legs. So that's one thing that's a little bit off about the picture. The other thing is that these groups of figures, are very much independent moments. There's not a huge sense of synergy in this painting. So you have, as we discussed, these separate planes, but you also have the Virgin and the Christ child on its own, not really overlapping with Joseph, perhaps a tiny bit. But then you have Joseph set back, he's got his own moment, his own corner, and then again the wall, and then again the donkey. So there's not a huge sense of this composition coming together. And that's enhanced, of course, by these very separate, distinctive color zones. So you have the red and the sort of fire of man, and the water of woman, the red and the ochre for Joseph, and the violet and the blue for the Virgin. And this is often something that was used, I don't know if it was intentional here, but I imagine it probably was, that the Virgin is blue, women are flowing, they are fertile, they are fluid, they are smooth, and men are fiery and sinuous and sort of harder. And that's kind of how the distinction here is being made, I think. And then of course, as we say, you have the donkey in his own moment, and his lovely grey fluffy fur chimes very much with the stone floor and the stone of the wall. But you do still get connections with the sort of stony off-white of the fabric that's both in Joseph's zone and in Mary's, and then of course in the donkeys and in the wall and floor beneath them as well. Another compositional sort of trick that Gentileschi is playing with here is that he is echoing the shape of the wall in the posture of the Virgin. So you have this stepped wall, of course, allowing us to see the donkey's head, but it's also echoed in the knee of the Virgin, which then runs along her leg and onto her foot, to give you a sense of exactly what's happening behind it, and the wall, it's sort of echoed in front. And then you have the figure of Joseph lying flat, which again sort of echoes what the wall's doing behind him. And then this perfectly vertical, perfectly central vertical of the wall stepping down divides the canvas, of course, into woman and man, male and female, or Virgin and Joseph, I suppose, holy and unholy. Perhaps that's a better way of interpreting it. And then also you have this horizontal, so you have the idea that you have the whole painting is divided into 4 quadrants, and this, of course, is reminiscent of the Passion, of the crucifix. So not only is it constructive, but it's also metaphorical, based on the story that we're looking at. Of course, the coming crucifixion, the coming Passion, which so often is hinted to in images of the Christ child, of Jesus when he's a baby. So where does this fit into Gentileschi's career? Who is Orazio Gentileschi? So Orazio Gentileschi was actually a Tuscan painter. He was born in Pisa in 1563. I say that with an actually because he's so associated with Caravaggio, the sort of Roman school. Often we think of him as a Roman painter, but he's born in Pisa to a father called Giovanni Battista Lomi, Lomi, which was a sort of his Tuscan surname. He moves to Rome as a teenager, and he takes his mother's surname, Gentileschi, perhaps so that he's not such a foreigner in Rome. Rome was an incredibly competitive, very violent city, and competitive as for artists. And so you very much wanted to belong, which his name, which of course then his daughter takes, Artemisia Gentileschi, who I'm sure many of you have heard about. So he lives in Rome in his teens. He sort of contributes to some large decorative cycles in some of the major churches, Santa Maria Maggiore, and also large fresco cycles he starts working on in some of the large palaces, in the Vatican Palace, specifically in the library there. But he's really working for other artists, getting his training, probably assisting other artists. And then in 1600, there's a kind of shift, because this is when we think he starts coming under the influence of Caravaggio, who's of course in Rome at this time and having great impact on a huge number of artists. And we know that they were acquainted in 1603. There is a lawsuit that is their press charges for libel against another artist, an artist called Giovanni Baglioni, who basically presses charges for these sort of defamatory poems that were being circulated throughout the artistic community in Rome. And in the documentation of the trial, we hear that Caravaggio thinks that Gentileschi is a gifted painter. So we know that they're friends. In 1612, there is, of course, the famous trial. I say, of course, but I'm sure some of you know, some of you perhaps don't. There is a trial for the rape of Gentileschi's daughter, Artemisia. And in the, which I'll explain a little bit about in a second, but in the documentation from that trial, we also hear that Gentileschi is borrowing, Orazio Gentileschi is lending Caravaggio certain props, which I quite like, the idea of. So he's lending him, we hear, a pair of angel wings, and also a Capuchin monk's habit, so that Caravaggio can use these for props in his paintings. I mentioned the rape trial. Gentileschi is working, Orazio Gentileschi, around this time in 1611, is working with an artist called Agostino Tassi, and they're working on frescoes on the Quirino Hill, and during this time they're obviously closely acquainted, and this artist Agostino Tassi ends up raping Orazio's daughter Artemisia, and there's a very, very complex and very well documented trial that ensues in 1612, because he had promised her that he would marry her after doing what he did, which of course was absolutely fine if that was the case, which he then didn't end up doing. So Orazio pressed charges against Tassi based on the fact that he had ruined the Gentileschi name, and that he wanted him to be punished for what he had done. So as a result of this, Orazio spends some time during the 1610s out of Rome. Tassi has a number of powerful people supporting him in this ongoing argument and trial. And so Gentileschi goes to the marshes. He goes to sort of east coast and works in Ancona, and then he in the 20s, in 1621, he's invited to Genoa, where he works for a nobleman there called Giovanni Antonio Sauli, and he works up there. He develops his own very elegant style, and it's from there that he then goes to Paris in 1624, and then perhaps surprisingly to many of you, he comes to England in 1626, and by this stage he's 63 years old, and he stays here until his death in 1639, working at the court of Charles I. So he had a very itinerant career within Italy, and then of course within Europe. He goes to Paris and works for Mary de Medici, so he's working for the royal family there, and it's there that he meets the Duke of Buckingham, who is in Paris to negotiate the marriage of the Princess Henrietta Maria to Charles I of England. And he invites him to London, and it's with the Duke of Buckingham in York House on the Strand that Gentileschi has lodgings and stays in London. And he primarily works for the Duke of Buckingham and the Queen during his time here, Queen Henrietta Maria. And then, of course, a year before he dies, his daughter Artemisia comes over to London as well. And Gentileschi had a very important role at the court of Charles I, because he was, of course, Italian and Catholic, and the Queen was Catholic. She was French, as I've said, but she had an Italian mother, Mary de Medici, and so he was obviously quite a support and a confidant of the Queen's, because we know that the papal envoy with whom the Queen is very close, a man called Gregorio Panzani, actually asks Orazio Gentileschi for advice on what Italian paintings he should be buying. So even though Gentileschi's advice is a little dated, he does offer advice as to what he should be purchasing for the Queen and for the royal family more broadly. So that's Orazio's career in a nutshell. I think in terms of his age, it's quite interesting to think that actually he comes here at 63, and he comes with his three sons, who he probably works alongside at moments and at moments not. We have, I think, about a dozen easel paintings by Orazio from this time in England, and these very important ceiling canvases that he paints for the ceiling of the Queen's house, which are now at Marlborough House in St. James's, much damaged and restored. But he comes over with his 3 sons, and Artemisia comes to join them later, as I say. Artemisia was the eldest of 4 children, and they lost their mother when Artemisia was 12, so in 1605. And so Orazio was really a single father with 4 children under the age of 12, alongside working as a painter during that time. In terms of this painting, I mentioned earlier that it's owned by the Birmingham Museums. It's currently hanging in the National Gallery. It's on loan there. But it's first recorded in Lucca in Tuscany in 1695, and it enters the collection of a man called Stefano Conti, who was quite an important patron in the 18th century, and had quite an important collection of vedute paintings, view paintings by artists like Canaletto, for example. But all of this time, it was actually with a different attribution. It had been attributed to several different Italian 17th century painters. It at some point entered the Duke of Lucca's collection, and then it was sold in the 19th century at Phillips in London to the Talbots, and then it hung at Margam Castle in Port Talbot in Wales. And it was there for a century. And then after that century, it was acquired by the Duke of Kent in 1941, and then in 1947 the painting was sold to Birmingham as Orazio for the first time. It had been actually sold to the Duke of Kent as Artemisia, so it went through a whole range of attributions, but eventually was attributed to Orazio in when it was purchased by Birmingham Museum, an art gallery. So that's a little bit on the provenance of the painting. If there is anything anyone wants to ask me, I should have said at the beginning, please do pop questions in the chat. I've seen that we've already got a few questions. Thank you so much. I knew I'd forgotten to speak about one thing. From Caroline, I'm curious to know if the painting was a commission, and if adding scenes to the birth story like this was common, and if there was a link between the commission and the subject matter. So that brings me on to what I wanted to say, which was that this is actually one of several versions that we know of this painting. So it may be a composition that might be familiar to you if you've been to the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna or to the Louvre in Paris. They both have versions of this painting, and I should have mentioned one was in the collection of the Duke of Buckingham, so hung at York House. That was a Vienna painting, and the other was perhaps the painting that was owned and inventoried in the collection of Charles I. There is a Rest on the Flight to Egypt by Orazio Gentileschi listed in his collection, and it may have been the one that is now in the Louvre. And then there is a sort of probably a studio work that was in the Getty, in the collection of John Paul Getty, as a fourth version. And then the right hand side of the painting of just the Virgin and Child is known in 3 other versions as well, 3 other different compositions. So one thing I should have mentioned is that Gentileschi, as his daughter did, and she very much would have learned from her father, reused compositions, moments from compositions, and this would have been done through one-to-one tracings that they would have marked up on a new canvas, and sort of reproduced what they had done before. Now, the most important thing to say about this picture is that you've probably seen the date on the information that I've been sending around. but this was probably the earliest of all four of the versions, and that was this was painted in probably in around 1620, and that's quite an important thing to think about when we think about these flaws that we discussed earlier, or perceived flaws in the painting, because this probably was an experimental, more of an experimental painting, and the donkey does not resurface. So he decides to omit the donkey. The hand, funnily enough, of the Virgin is always at in profile. It's not always foreshortened. This is the only version that it's foreshortened so effectively. And the figures of Joseph and Mary are sort of closer together in other versions. So they do vary from one to the other, but in terms of the commission, we don't know anything about who commissioned this picture. But and in answer to your question about adding scenes to the birth story, adding sort of scenes to well-known biblical passages, or adding or elaborating on these passages, or inventing moments perhaps, that is something that, of course, if something was going to suit the artist in terms of what they were able to experiment with, they certainly would have found a way to do that, and that may have been by elaborating on certain moments, or simply picking very, very small moments in the biblical narrative to paint, and then of course they could invent as they wished. But also you would have been beholden to a client, and in this case we don't know about those circumstances. Yes, thank you, Kath. The poems sound fascinating. Can I read them somewhere? So these are the poems that I was talking about, which were published by against Giovanni Baglioni, one of the artists in Rome. Apparently by other artists, they'd been circulating critical poems. You can, they are published. So most books on Artemisia or on Orazio specifically, or even Artemisia, will publish at least extracts from them. In fact, there was an exhibition in 2001 on Artemisia and Orazio together at the Met, and there's a whopping catalogue that you can actually read online. There's a PDF available online on the Met's website, and I don't know if they transcribe some of the poems, but perhaps they have them there. But certainly the rape trial is all transcribed and is absolutely horrific to read, and feels like it could have been written only yesterday. You know, it's so relatable. Francis Hall, where is he buried? Gentileschi, where is Orazio Gentileschi buried? He was buried, I think this is right, he was buried in the Queen's Chapel in Somerset House, which was another of the Queen's residences. So he paints the ceiling for the Queen's house in Greenwich, I should have said. But of course she had multiple palaces, and Somerset House, which was actually known as Denmark House, was her house. Denmark was the name of her mother-in-law, of Charles I's mother, Anne of Denmark, and she had built Denmark House, and then it becomes Somerset House later. But Anne of Denmark had left Somerset House to Henrietta Maria, and she had a chapel there, a Catholic chapel, and I'm pretty sure that Gentileschi was buried in the chapel there, and Rubens had done a painting in their altarpiece, but sadly, I think during the Civil War, the chapel was destroyed. But I'm pretty sure that she gave Orazio Gentileschi the honor of being buried in her private chapel. So that says quite something. From Nicholas, the child is either out of proportion or much older than a breastfeeding baby would be, and also looks quite feminine. Is this also a technical inaccuracy, and painted with no clothing, which is a contrast? Yes, so to answer the last part of your question first, this is actually the only version, I think, where the Christ child's completely nude. So that was something that he obviously then decided to rectify or remedy. And again, I agree with you. The Christ child is an actual child rather than an infant, and does feel far too old to be breastfeeding. So I think perhaps it may have been that this was the age of the child that he was drawing or painting from life. And that he needed to sort of make it work with the story that he was trying to tell. But this is why, as I mentioned, that some scholars have argued that this is actually the return from Egypt, which I don't know how convincing I find that argument based on Caravaggio's composition of the flight into Egypt. However, I think there's a strong argument on which to base that, which is that the child is much older, and that is probably, in my view, just what was available at the time in order to paint this scene. So I think that's probably the answer there. From Marianne, is there a message in the pattern on the donkey's left ear? Olive branch. Let's have a look. Oh, that's a lovely observation. You might well be correct. So Marianne has pointed out that there is, that is a really wonderful observation. Do you know what, that there's a sort of a sprig of some sort, or a branch, or in the donkey's ear, and I've always found the ear so purposefully turned towards us, which of course we know from when they hear something and sort of prick their ears, but it really is sort of facing us, this ear, and confronting us. And interestingly, there is a miracle performed by the Christ child, and I think that's on the return from Egypt, where they are trying to, or it might be on the flight into Egypt actually, but where they're trying to find food, and Joseph is trying to reach a palm branch, I think, and Jesus turns it into a branch with dates on it, I think, so that in order for them to have food. Do with that what you will. It's a wonderful observation, and I can't stop seeing it now. I wonder if that's a reference to the impending miracle, or simply just a palm branch in reference to Jesus, but or as you say, an olive branch. But that's certainly an interesting idea, and something that I'm very grateful to you for pointing out. Thank you. Great. Well, I think that's all of the questions answered. So if there is nothing else, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And I would like to thank you all very, very much for joining this evening. And next week, we will be looking at Titian's Flaying of Marsyas, which is a beautiful painting, but depicts a terrible subject. So we're going to be thinking about pain and beauty when looking at that next week. So I do hope some of you will be able to join us, but otherwise have a wonderful week and see you very soon. Thank you very much.